Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining us for our Workday Chats today. I'm your host for today's discussion. If you have any questions, please do enter them in the comments below. We would love to have a conversation during this session. So I'm Katie Coletto. I'm the Senior Director of Solution Marketing here at Workday, and I handle mostly the talent side of Workday, but also the return to work activity we're doing and the vaccine management activity. So I've been deep in all of our COVID-19 related activity. And today I am joined with two fabulous panelists. So I'd like to introduce Bhushan Sethi, who's the Joint Global Leader, People and Organization at PwC, and Bill Gilmart, who is our Senior Director of Product Marketing at Workday. So Bhushan, would you mind just kind of introducing yourself to our attendees?
Thanks, Katie, and hi, Bill. Thanks for having me. I have the privilege of leading PwC's Global People and Organization practice. I live here in New York with a young family. I work with clients across the globe in different industries around some of their workforce topics, and have been knee-deep in this topic of thinking about return to work strategies, thinking about improving remote ways of working, how do companies start to think about return to growth. So really excited to share some experiences and engage in this dialogue.
Excellent. And Bill?
Sure, Katie, thank you. Nice to meet you, Bhushan. I'm Bill Gilmart, and I live in Connecticut. And I represent Workday's Office of Finance Solutions, specifically around the VP of FP&A and financial planning and budgeting and forecasting. And we've seen a lot of exciting things happen, obviously, around this area where companies are trying to quickly respond to the changes that we've all been dealing with. And we've been seeing a lot of activity around scenario planning and those types of things to help companies prepare financially. And now we're starting to see more activity around the types of things you're trying to plan the return to work and getting employees safely back to the office.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's nice to have this, our kind of cross-functional perspectives today. So the HR side, the operational side, the finance side, the planning side. So hopefully we can bring all of that into the conversation, because I don't know if there's ever been quite as cross-functional an activity as we've had now over the last year, and really being able, really forcing all of the parts of the organization to work together. So with COVID-19 vaccines coming and getting more and more widely available, we're hearing a lot from our customers that they're working to create policies and processes and programs around vaccine management and really understand kind of the potential timelines. What should they plan for? What are the protocols to really keep their workers safe? So I wanted to kind of, open up this discussion and really analyze how different industries are handling that, are responding, discuss how cross-functional teams like we're representing today can really work together to form a successful approach to vaccine management. So why don't we start out by just talking about how our organizations responded at the start of the pandemic. And maybe Bhushan, we'll start with you. What are some key takeaways that you've learned in 2020 that you're bringing into 2021 with you? And hopefully we'll build on. And I really like your idea of return to growth. So what is the foundation that you're going to draw on to drive the return to growth?
Yeah, I would say what we learned in our own organization is that if we collaborate, engage in an open mind around new ways of working, and become are very transparent and vulnerable, we can really get through anything. And so what I mean by that is everyone struggled at the start, and everyone's still struggling with something around this pandemic, whether it's I want to go see my football team in a stadium, I want to go to that restaurant, I want to go to a bar, I want to go back to the workplace even. Our kids want to go back to school to some degree. So everyone's struggling with something, and just being really vulnerable as leaders, as employees, to have those conversations, it's totally okay. Really having a positive mindset to say, we can embrace change. We can embrace change in terms of learning about the vaccine, learning about transmission of the disease, learning much more about epidemiology, can't even say it, learning about economic data, and yes, thank you. We're all scientists, and we're all health experts and economists, and understanding human behavior. So it's really important to just embrace transparency, have a positive mindset, at the same time be vulnerable and try and get to the other side, whether that's a growth plan for your company, whether that's survival mode, whether that's working in a sector that's irreparably structurally damaged, like if you're in the hospitality industry and needing to reskill into something else. I think that the need to really focus on what's positive about this is an important lesson learned for our own organization, but also for many of our clients.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that focus on what is the positive lesson is really interesting. And I think, we've seen certainly an uptick in the whole digitalization and digital upskilling, looking at all of the different characteristics that we can now deliver digitally instead of in person. And Bill, any thoughts on kind of from a Workday perspective and from a finance perspective where you've seen customers kind of learn some lessons in 2020?
Yeah, definitely, Kathy. I think, we all started off with this huge, inability to know what was going to happen next. And, in finance, I mean, obviously, the first things that everyone had to look at was, their expenses and their cash flow and understanding, the stability of the company. And also like the workforce, we were just starting the new year. So there was hiring that was starting to take place, right? And it's very challenging because you are competing for quality talent very aggressively, and it's tough to press pause. So in this case, everyone was kind of pressing pause, but in some respects, companies were still hiring that key talent they needed.
Right.
I think also what we found was like the number of our customers that quickly twisted, their plans and shaped them to understand what their expense profile looked like, right? And they created a number of scenarios on the fly to do some what if analysis, right? And I think the thing that we also learned was usually companies understand their business drivers. And in this case, the supply chain was out of whack. All of a sudden now you had to rely on third parties and their ability to participate in your supply chain. And so ultimately, companies that were able to be agile and continually to plan and replan were successful. And I think, if anything has proven through this whole process is the annual plan is clearly dead. There's, as soon as it's done, it changes. And now the one thing I will say is it forced companies to think about how they should plan their business going forward, right? And so you had this process of, well, what's my view, what's my outlook, and how often do I have to plan? And then once we get a handle on that, now we have to start thinking about, as the vaccines become available, companies are looking to have employees go back to the office. And what does that planning look like? And there's all new drivers and new things we have to think about now. In many situations, companies think about, like, what are the healthcare needs? And do I need to have a health professional on staff to help me, through this process?
Exactly. And as you say that, before this, we were talking to Bhushan and realized he's the first person I've seen in an office in a year. So it's a huge step, but I'm really excited to see that. And speaking of, planning for maybe a healthcare person on staff, or we're seeing a lot of customers also plan for on-site clinics and enhanced health and wellness communications and support. What are some of the other kind of imperatives that you would say that our community here should plan for 2021?
Well, go ahead. I think that there's a market shift, right? There's what's interesting, and we were just talking about it before the start of this call. Depending upon where you're located, your geography and your community has different set of requirements and different regulations that everyone's going through. So if anything, the variables are just evolving as we know. And what's really important, I think, as a trend is getting employee feedback, understanding the situations of your employees and tracking that and able to use that in your planning process. And you said it was cross-functional earlier. I mean, it is, because not only do you have to think about the human side of things, but you also have to think about the expenses that you're going to incur by retrofitting offices. I think, Bhushan, PwC did some great studies about, what the expectations are going to be about reimagining the office going forward.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, to connect a couple of points that you both made. Planning is alive. Planning fueled by the data that Bill, you described in terms of what is the financial health of the business? What is the health issues within a particular state or city? Because health is going to be very local. How do we think about consumer behavior in those cities for those businesses that rely on in-person health contacts and those that have to be in the office, essential workers? How do we bring them to the office, keep them in the office safely? And the next big challenge, as you mentioned, 2021, is how do we operate this hybrid workplace for those that feel comfortable returning to the office over the next, let's say, 6 to 9 months? How do they return safely? What does a hybrid workplace look and feel like from a technology, from a culture and a leadership perspective? And how do we make sure that the good things we talked about at the start of this call, that we don't lose them and that we don't have equity issues with some of the remote workers or hybrid workers that are going to be primarily remote? And we've seen big challenges through the pandemic for certain demographics, blue collar workers in certain industries, disproportionate amount of females leaving the workplace because of having to take care of children. So how do we not reverse some of the goodness? And there's worries that the inequity, specifically around females leaving, is a real challenge for organizations and for society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a couple points that I'd love for you to dig into is, one, with this hybrid remote workforce, we're certainly seeing an acceleration overall in digital transformation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on if you were advising a client, what are the priorities to look at to make that shift? And I know PwC has been on the forefront of that, from a largely in-person workforce to really that hybrid world.
Yeah, maybe a couple of things there. Those firms that had an effective digital way of working, so they had effective collaboration tools, they could use video conferencing, they were comfortable with document sharing, they interacted with clients through digital channels. Those companies absolutely were stronger in terms of productivity, engagement, and business performance. The next frontier, though, for a lot of companies, even though those companies that are strong in digital, really changing how you work and how you lead with inclusion and how you run hybrid teams and all of the meeting etiquette and the discipline that we need, how you focus on mental health and manage people from burnout, given that a number of people in a number of industries have worked significantly long hours through the pandemic. That's really the next frontier. How you drive that work and that work experience using the tools, but also being conscious on how leaders need to bring people along, engage teams, upskill teams, use different types of technologies. I ran a global meeting with my global leadership team using a mix of virtual reality and other gaming tools. It obviously saved a lot on our airfare and our carbon footprint, not having to fly to Europe, but it was really experiential. It was really experiential, and we had the headsets on, and it was great. But to do that session every day is exhausting. So selectively seeing where we can augment the technology, maybe it's virtual or augmented reality. I think that's one of the next pieces of the frontier. But what concerns me now is that we don't focus on this in an inclusive way, and that we don't focus on the culture and the meeting etiquette and the work etiquette because we have these tools and we have the ability to work longer hours. Bill, what are you seeing?
Well, I think those are all great points. What's interesting, though, is, I think we all approach this initially like, well, how long will this last? Maybe it's a few months. And, then over time, you realize that this is not changing anytime quickly. And I've always been somewhat of a remote employee. I've been on the road a lot with customers and traveling to different offices. So I'd say my typical work week was, a month was a week in the office, the home office, and then 3 weeks out. I've gone stir crazy. It's one thing to be able to leave. It's another thing to be here all the time and with all the distractions. And I think people need to learn how to kind of work remotely. It's not just something you get up and you can do. You actually have to train yourself and understand how to do it. And I think there's there's great lessons learned, and we've had to do a lot of things to help achieve success for our customers remotely. We've also been very successful in helping to understand how to help ourselves and be more productive, right? At the same time, that productivity does come with, as you mentioned, burnout. One of the things that I found really true is we talk a lot about agility of organizations to be successful in a changing world, right? But ultimately, we went through our own organizational agility exercise. And we found ourselves having to stay more connected and to understand how to collaborate more effectively, right? And I think those are important things that we've seen happen with ourselves, employees, and our customers. And I'll give you a great, for instance, the companies that actually have a cloud-based platform at their disposal in finance can seamlessly close and forecast and understand their business. But those that don't have that, they're using spreadsheets still. It's very challenging to turn on a dime and to achieve any kind of agility. And I think that's also challenging, right? You're frustrated because you don't have access to the tools or the things that were on your desktop in the office. And so I think all these things have made it really challenging. But at the same time, to your point, there are some silver linings in that we can be more effective and more efficient, remotely where it makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I think, as we've seen it in software in particular, companies have probably been easier to adapt to those types of things, whereas other businesses, they're not used to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, what you say, like we've had to find new ways to do what we were used to doing. And I think one of those areas from an HR perspective is in that manager-employee relationship. And I've noticed we don't have the informal communication time as much. So how do we get that feedback from employees? How do we really understand how the team is feeling, or who's feeling overwhelmed and who has extra bandwidth, and how do we collaborate in a way that is fluid and natural in this new world we're in, where everything is scheduled? And I think looking to some of the technology around employee listening, around surveys, around feedback, and really I think we've pushed the envelope. And how do we look at analyzing the people in our organization along with the finance? I think finance has always been really used to analyzing things and analyzing numbers and plans. HR side, not as much. And we've certainly, I think, progressed many years, if not decade, in our ability to collect data on what we kind of previously thought were more soft issues, and be able to really use that data more effectively to guide managers and to guide those employee relationships. So it's been interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I would add to that the stigma of some of the topics that we're starting to mention, like mental health, people being concerned about their job security, their health security. It's okay to talk about that now. So right. It's okay to talk about well-being. It's okay to talk about flexibility and needing to take some time off, whether it's during the day or take vacation time or a mental health day. These things were stigmatized really pre-COVID. It's okay to talk about systemic racism in the workplace. Now it has to be in the US post George Floyd. It's okay to talk about divisiveness, given that we've just finished a very divisive US election, whatever side of the political aisle you're on. And the more and more we get into some of these topics, even the return to the workplace, in my own organization, in many of my clients' organizations, is a very divisive topic. People do not have the similar agreements. Our stats tell us that there are certain employees that we've polled who feel that they're trading their safety for their employability, for employment. And that's essential workers and office workers. So we really need to make sure that there's open dialogue around these next topics. And the things that really worry me, Katie, is the stigmatism that could come from being a remote worker for a company that's primarily an in-person culture. It could be a large global bank, it could be a tech firm, it could be a healthcare firm, private equity. A number of these firms have actually said, we want to get back to the office, probably in a hybrid way. We have an apprentice model. We want to bring young talent in. We miss the social interaction and the creativity. And again, an emotive topic, because a lot of people may be listening to this to say, we don't want to do that. We don't want to return to the old way. We don't want to put our health at risk. So really putting on the table that these are topics and that hopefully responsible purpose-led companies will design with choice and employee preference and safety and well-being at the center, and really kind of define what's appropriate for their culture and what the right tools are and the right inclusive leadership. Hopefully that happens in 2021, and this return to workplace doesn't become yet another divisive issue in the US workplace.
Yeah, could you imagine? And I'd be interested, I know you have done some really interesting research around employee sentiment around both receiving vaccines and sharing health information such as vaccination status with their employer. And it'd be interesting to hear if you are seeing, significant differences around the world in your global role as you talk to both global organizations or organizations who are headquartered regionally. Are you seeing different trends pop up that our community out there listening to us should be aware of?
Yeah, I'd say so. First of all, in the US, we've been polling the US workers since May on various topics around work and workplace. In January, we polled 1,100 workers and asked questions about return to workplace, specifically around some of the safety procedures. So what was probably not surprising to most people here is we asked a question around vaccines. 54% of respondents were very willing to show proof of vaccine as part of a return to workplace piece. So again, it shows that half the population is divided on whether they wanted to kind of show proof of vaccine. 72% were comfortable wearing masks in the workplace. Only 35% were comfortable signing up to a workplace contact tracing app. What's interesting about both of those, and Bill, you mentioned this earlier in terms of our consumer behaviors in our communities, wearing masks and temperature checking and signing up to contact tracing on the consumer side are norms for certain people in certain parts of the US, and certain people are divided on them. So as your consumer behavior goes, so your workplace behavior might go, and those two are inextricably linked. When I go to the gym, I get my temperature checked. When I go to a restaurant, I get temperature checked. When I go to get my coffee, I go in with a mask, and the same thing in communal parts of my office as a hybrid worker. So I think the real challenge for organizations is doubling down on the communications around all these safety protocols to say, for those people that are returning, whether it's for 1 day or 5 days, here are the safety procedures. This is similar to what we want in our consumer life, whether we're going back to school, going back to a workplace, going to a restaurant, going to a sports stadium or a cinema. And it's a communal civic responsibility. And again, in itself, and I unapologetically highlight that there are many different views on the topics that I just raised. And that's why we need to double down on inclusive leadership and not a one-size-fits-all strategy.
Absolutely. And Bill, I'm interested in your thoughts around that, and also how it relates to the finance and planning functions within organization, knowing that we're going to have these very divisive, very pronounced splits and sections in our workforce going forward.
Yeah, I think this is obviously an emerging topic, right, of concern. And I think like any organization, the more data you have available, the better decisions you can make. And so where you have information that you can capture, whether it's, obviously the volunteer information about vaccines is one, about people who want to go back to work is another. So you have to take that and have to equate, the capacity and introducing social distancing and all the controls inside the workplace. You have to start thinking about what's the expense for those things, right? How many employees could we bring back to a facility, and understanding what types of employees you can bring back to the facility. I think it also relates back to your recruiting and hiring. As companies are now dealing with this and adjusting their plans, they're looking to hire in a different way than it did before. So now, location is still a factor, but it may not be as big a factor as it was before. I think more than anything, when we look at this stuff, like if we put it into dollars and cents, like for instance, hiring a salesperson, You look at what is the length of time that person needs to get up to speed to hit their quota and be profitable for their business, right?
Mhm.
And now we have to think about what's it like for new employees to enter a company where they're not going into the office to collect their stuff on the first day. There's not the training and the programs there. It's vastly different for all of us that have been working with the same people for a longer period of time to know who to go to and how to do that. And in many sets, it's more cost efficient when we have that network. But we have to introduce things, I think, that will help us build a network now. So overall, when you look at this, I think, there's puts and takes on the expense side. Clearly, the discretionary travel and expense has been reduced significantly. The question is now, what are the expenses going to be that are going to, handle that issue and help us be more successful from a business perspective, And quite honestly, we're seeing this ourselves where, people like face-to-face conversation. And when they're purchasing products and services, they like to be able to do that. And now we're changing that whole process, right? So I think, overall, from finance perspective, I think we're still looking at identifying what the business drivers are and trying to allocate the right expense where we can. But I think, you mentioned before, I think, like, where are we going to turn the business around and actually grow? And so I think there's a lot of analysis about, how we can grow and how we can return to profitability and expand our organization. So the process of looking at the financial data with company data is really important, right? And I think even like when you look at mergers and acquisitions, it's another area where you have to understand the types of people, the corporate culture, and the corporate culture is changing. And I think that's one of the things I think that's been a hallmark at Workday is any acquisitions we've done have been culturally matched to what Workday's culture and values are. And now we're introducing a number of new values to the equation. And quite honestly, we talk about it here a lot. The inclusion and the things that we're doing around, diversity and so forth. We see it ourselves. I mean, having people get on stage and talk about many of the things that have been very unpleasant and very difficult to talk about openly. And clearly that affects everybody, affects the productivity of an organization and certainly their effectiveness.
Yeah. So I guess I'm hearing from both of you kind of some imperatives over the next few years, certainly be inclusive management. How do we manage in a way that is thoughtful, that is open, that is vulnerable, that brings in people from, with all sorts of, with all different profiles and in a diverse and inclusive way. And then, that continuous planning, other areas that we think that folks have to kind of really pay more attention to as we go forward into this, whatever this next generation of work that we're going to experience is.
Yeah, so Bill mentioned early on kind of planning, and maybe just to pick back off that, because one of the big scenarios we obviously didn't plan for was a pandemic. We've got through it in different industries, and there's been good collaboration across different functions. But the devastating consequences of what's been happening down in Texas with our friends and our colleagues because of a lack of preparedness around changing weather patterns. That can happen again. That can happen in many parts of the US and many parts of the world. How do businesses, how do communities, how do workforces prepare for that? So whether it's a climate topic, whether it's a cyber issue, whether it's another health or a pandemic type of issue, how do firms get geopolitical tensions? How do firms get much more creative with dynamic planning, as Bill mentioned? How do they make sure that their strategy team or their line of business strategy teams and their finance professionals and their HR professionals and technology teams are working together to say, what does this mean to how we locate our supply chain? Should we diversify the number of suppliers? How do we think about where our people are located, whether that's on a temporary basis because maybe they've moved out of their city to the suburbs or staying with friends, or if they've relocated on a permanent basis? How do we understand where people are located? How do we understand where we have risks? Do we have a number of contingent workers or contractors who are doing work for us that maybe we don't have enough data on? So one stat, when we polled HR leaders in the fall, we asked them a question about how good is your data? Do you know where your people are? 20% of the HR leaders said they do not know where their people are on a daily basis. For me, that's a real risk from a business continuity, from a security, and also a tax compliance issue, but more importantly, from a business continuity and a people perspective. So wherever we see kind of planning, and you mentioned data, Bill, are so important in this pandemic, whether it's people data, financial data, product and customer data.
And I
think what's important is that the data is operational in nature, it's financial, and it's personal data, right? It's about the employee sentiment. And those things haven't been modeled in you know, as long as I could recall. You know, now we have to think about those things. I mean, you just think about it, like when you have the data available, it makes it easier to make some decisions. But when you don't have the data and you can't get the data necessarily, it's challenging, right? And I think companies that have a way and an approach to and a philosophy to get that data, protect it, and share it where it's in its transparency can be more effective. And you know, ultimately, you know, as I mentioned before, you know, the annual plan is dead, and I think really we're in this continuous planning cycle. And one of the most important things about an agile company in this time that we're living is that there's connection between the business and the decisions and the things that are happening in the business. And I'll give you a great example, right? When we talked about what happened with the onset of COVID, you know, we're looking at expenses, and the employee is the largest expense for many of the companies out there. And so what happens with that? You know, how do we change our hiring plans? And what do we do? And how do we communicate that broadly to the organization, right? And so it's really important as the models change and as we change our plans and our expectations based on the forecast and actual things that are happening, that we can adjust and keep everybody in sync. Because that's the important thing is, you know, a plan without execution and alignment is no plan at all. And so I think it's really important that, you know, when you think about the technology platform, the CIO, when you think about the human capital management platform, the HR lead, the CHRO, and in the finance organization, aligning that with your sales and your revenue generation, you have to be able to collaborate and understand what impact is happening out in the market and how you can adjust that to that, right? So if revenue is lagging, you know, what do you need to do with your expenses and how do you offset that? So these are still key principles in running a business, but I think they're intensified by a lot of the drivers that we haven't seen before. And a lot of those are employee based.
Yeah, exactly. And that ability to change, so the organizational agility, not just from a planning perspective, but the ability to execute on that, to actually have the levers to make the changes really quickly. And also from that people perspective, being able to communicate effectively in a relevant way, in a contextual way with your workforce, with different teams in a way that's scalable and personal so that you can replicate that in-person relationship a little bit using technology. So I think it's an interesting way to think a little bit differently about putting people first, which is something that we've been, you know, working on for years. So last question, really quickly, I think we're out of time, but 2 things that you think will be different in the future of work, or 2 pieces that will stay from what we've adapted to in this pandemic and become permanent in the future of work. Let's start with Bhushan.
My perspective is there's going to be a reset of how we measure value. And what I mean by that, and Bill mentioned some of the financial measures, we're going to add to that in terms of safety measures and well-being. We are no longer going to say that safety is an add-on. We're going to actually measure the wellness and the ability to provide a safe, either on-site or remote workplace. We're going to, and we're already starting to measure diversity, inclusion, and equity in different ways. The SEC disclosures here in the US, the focus on ESG metrics going forward. And that creation of value, if it doesn't translate down to how you and I get measured and different members of front office, back office, it doesn't work. So a whole reset on how we measure. And yes, it does challenge some of the focus on our capitalist system and how we allocate capital and how we make decisions based on investors. So One is around measurement, and the second is very tactical. We're going to value flexibility a lot more. And
Mhm.
flexibility is a lot more than just the physical workplace. It's a lot more than where you work. It's not about the office or home. It may be
Mhm.
much more about both and making sure it's exclusive, but it's about how we work. And at the start of this conversation, we talked about having the right digital tools, having the right culture and the right measures. So for me, it's about measures and it's about flexibility.
Excellent. And Bill?
Well, I
Hard
just
to
think
follow.
that I just think, you know, my two things are change is here and it's a constant. So,
Uh-huh.
you know, organizations need to be agile. And I think in general, I think we need to understand that, you know, there's a lot of unknowns. And the only way to kind of be comfortable in that is to be able to quickly analyze and adjust and be able to keep everyone connected and collaborate. And
Mhm.
ultimately, I think people are going to look back at this time, and we need to evolve from it and recognize that, you know, this is a historic event. And at the end of the
Mhm.
day, you know, we are adapting as we and learning and figuring out this process in real time.
Agree. And I think one more to add is, I guess it's two sides of the same coin, but one, it's kind of trust and vulnerability. As you started with, Bhushan, is one, I think organizations and employees alike are being more open about vulnerabilities and making being okay with communicating those and talking about those in public. And then the other side of it is trust. And I think there's going to be a change or a shift in trust for the organization. And I think we've started to see that. And as our customers or as organizations have stepped up and started providing more around mental health, financial health, more guidance around healthcare, as other institutions in our society have become more polarized, I think we're seeing employee trust of their employer increase in relation to trust of other institutions. And I think that's gonna change the work relationship going forward as well. Anything else? Last thoughts to add? I think we've covered.
I would just say for folks who have not lived through an economic recession before, we get through these. Certain things will change. Maybe it's around flexibility in the way we use technology and what we value in our personal and our work lives. But we'll get through this, and we just have to kind of keep our heads down and get through it together. The other thing I would say is all of these grandiose predictions that we make, including consultants like me, around what will be changed forever, we always exaggerate kind of change, and maybe the numbers that we cite around how many people might be in a physical office may be different. Maybe the technology that we all talk about, maybe it's going to be more mainstream. So we do have a focus sometimes to over exaggerate the degree of change that might happen around all elements of business and technology. But I guess the most important thing is we do get through these. Certain things will be slightly different. A lot of things will be kind of the same. We just have to kind of keep our collective business and heads in our business and our personal lives.
Exactly.
Bill?
No, I think that sums it up. I mean, let's just hope that you know, whatever the new normal is, that we can adjust and thrive in it.
Exactly. Well, I'd like to thank both of you for joining us today. Thanks, Workday, for making this space for us to have the conversation. I think it's important. I appreciate everybody joining us in the comments and the conversations online. So with that, I'd like to say have a great Workday and join us again next time for Workday Chats as well. The hashtag there is hashtag Workday Chats, just in case. Thank you again. Have a great day.